Welcome back to another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. I am James Yost, partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Travis York, owner of 3-1 Advisors. Travis, how are you?
I'm doing great today, James. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. We are back with another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. James and Travis here as always. Travis, it's our 15th episode. Very fun stuff. Who are we talking to today?
We've got Mr. Paul Diaz with us today. He is a seasoned veterinary recruiter. Paul diving into the technology space, which I'm sure I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today and learning about. Also a military veteran. Paul, thank you for your service. So just all kinds of experience to draw upon. And I think we're going to, Paul, probably dive into one of your favorite topics, which is the non-compete.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate you guys for having me.
Well, we're certainly excited. I think first and foremost that you're willing to join us and talk about this topic. I think it's something that is really critical in the industry and the veterinary space. I've been around this space my entire life. Grew up in my dad's hospital and now worked professionally in it for 20 years. And what the non-compete looks like is vastly different today than what it was when I started in this world in 2001. And so excited that you're here and really appreciate you taking the time. But I guess, where I always like to start is let's just learn a little bit more about you and how you got where you are and ended up doing veterinary recruiting and now helping veterinarians at an individual level.
Gosh, this journey, this wasn't a journey I had anticipated. It wasn't something that I planned at all, but I joined the Marine Corps right out of high school. And they sent me from New Jersey, where I was born and raised, out to San Diego, down to Camp Pendleton. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I started working at a nuclear power plant right there in San Diego County. So I just exchanged one uniform for another. And I was going to school. At night. And by the time I completed my degree, a very entry-level management position opened up, and I applied for it. I was awarded that position. Next thing you know, 9/11 happened, and the security force at that power plant went from, if I remember correctly, it was something like 60 to maybe 70 security officers, and then they needed to staff up to about 400, and they needed to do so very quickly. For some reason, I got picked to lead that initiative, and apparently I did it pretty well. Next thing that happened was the site staffing manager ended up getting promoted. So I was asked to apply for that position. I got that position, and then that was actually my first job in the recruiting space. So I've never actually held the job title as a recruiter. My first position was the manager of that recruiting team, but luckily I adopted probably the best recruiting team in that entire company. And those folks, they took me under the wing, showed me everything that I needed to know. And that's how I learned what I learned about recruiting, was from that first team. And then, that transitioned into other jobs for other companies. Then I transitioned into healthcare, worked in emergency medicine and family practice medicine. And then one day I got a call from a recruiter who was recruiting for a vice president of DVM recruiting for one of the country's biggest veterinary employers. So I ended up applying for that one. I got that job, and the rest is history.
Wow, that's awesome. So, you're a pretty vocal advocate for associates just in the veterinary space and others really, but your big thing that you've been really on the soapbox discussing is the non-compete agreement. So what specifically about that? Like, what is driving that passion? How did you find this as something you were going to try to tackle in the industry at large?
Well, when I left my last corporate position at Vice President DVM Recruiting, I decided to start my own company. That was the Higher Power Consulting Company. Now, there's a couple reasons why I did that. Number one, I needed to test my concept for Offer First, which is the company I'm launching this year. But I also, I just saw an opportunity in the space. I knew that the veterinary industry was nothing more than a war for talent. And I knew that with my skill set, I could do things differently. I could represent the candidates better than anybody else out there. So I knew that I'd be able to carve out a niche, but I needed to do it differently, right? Because the model that most external recruiters use is just antiquated to me. And I think that it puts a lot of time at risk, not just for me, but for the candidate and the employer that is involved in the engagement. So that's how I came up with the whole offer first concept.
When you're talking about the kind of the current process or the historical process that you're focused on disrupting, which I want to get into a little bit, but when you're talking about the process being antiquated, are there a few kind of key points that, like a lot of entrepreneurs, you identified ahead of focusing on building a solution for those key pain points?
Well, yeah, the first one is that, I mean, as any entrepreneur knows, we just don't have time to waste, right? And the traditional process, or the process used by every other, external recruiter, just puts a lot of time at risk. And that was something that, as a new business owner, I just didn't have the luxury of, I didn't have the luxury of taking that level of risk, right? So in this model where I only get paid if the offer is accepted, and I have to manage that relationship. And that relationship between a candidate and employer can take, 3-4 weeks up to months, 3-4 months sometimes. So I'm, as that middleman, I'm in there navigating that and managing that relationship. And if the employer lowballs the candidate at the very end, well, they both get to start over again, but I'm the one who doesn't get to eat. So I needed some way to minimize that risk exposure. And that's one of the reasons I came up with the offer first process.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I mean, so let's just kind of dive in. You obviously have a passion around addressing some of the concerns and discrepancies and obstacles of the non-compete. Can you just share with our listeners a little bit about, maybe what drives that passion for you, how you've experienced it, and what you kind of view as maybe some of the I'll just use the word unfair, Paul. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but just some of the issues with the non-compete that really keep you up at night.
Well, I would start off by saying it is unfair, and I'll explain why here shortly. But like I said, I grew up, my entire professional career was in California where non-competes don't exist. Mm-hmm. So it was never something that was just on my radar. And even as the vice president of recruiting for that large corporate employer, it's not like I was engaging with the candidates. I didn't have the conversations with the doctors. My recruiters did. So when I started my own company and started having those conversations, that's when I started hearing these stories of the impact of the non-compete, right? And yeah, I understood the first few were, okay, I get it. Is that part of becoming a veterinarian? Maybe it is. I didn't know at that time. But what I realized is that the frequency of these stories was disturbing. And then finally, this one story that I listened to, it was late 2020. A young veterinarian reached out to me for help because I had helped one of her friends. And, as I listened to her story, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And she was the reason that I took up this advocacy. She was the subject of the article that I wrote that I published on LinkedIn. Vin picked it up as well. It was titled Suffer in Silence. And those were her words. She described the work environment that she was in. And as bad as it was, I had asked her, I said, so just tell me, how are you dealing with this currently? And she said, well, Paul, I go to work every day. I do the very best I can for my patients, and I just suffer in silence. And when she said that, that was the moment I knew that I was going to do something about this.
Wow. That's super powerful. And, thinking through it with our relationships and clients, I see both sides. What I don't see is the data to, show exactly which side is the majority of cases and which side are some of the anecdotal bad cases. So would love anything that you have on that. I don't know if you have anything prepared there, but that's something we'd be interested in learning more on. But in addition to that, talking about now that the non-compete is on the national spotlight with the FTC, what are your thoughts on that situation? It sounds like, with your start in California where non-competes are outlawed, I would imagine that this is welcome news, but I've heard that you think otherwise about this FTC eliminating the non-compete. So can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, let me be really clear. It absolutely is welcome news. And I think the timing of it couldn't have been better, at least not for me, right? So, and in regards to my previous comments on other podcasts and even on LinkedIn, I did make a comment where I said that if the government steps in and ends non-competes before I was able to influence enough veterinarians to end it on their own, I felt that my advocacy would essentially be a failure, right? I would consider my advocacy a failure. And the reason I said that is because my mission with this advocacy from day one has been rock solid, and it has been to empower and educate the veterinarians to take this industry back, right? To empower them to stand up, refuse the non-competes, to engage in dialogue with their employers around ending the current non-competes, and to change the industry themselves, because I truly believe that the veterinarian is the most powerful person in the veterinary industry. It's not the CEOs of these multi-billion-dollar corporations. They don't get their paychecks unless the veterinarians show up to work, right? Now, yeah, we can scale that back and say, well, yes, the veterinarian is a very powerful person and they rely on the technicians. So the technicians are just as powerful. And I would agree, right? And the technicians rely on the hospital managers and the practice managers and their support staff. So all of those hospital-based employees, those are the ones that are the most powerful in this industry. It's not the executives. It's not the operational leaders. It's not the ones that are sitting in the meetings and driving the metrics and creating the PowerPoints. No, it's the ones with their boots on the ground, taking care of the patients. And those folks, once they realize how powerful they are, then everybody else needs to watch out, because that's when the industry is going to shift. And that's what my goal has always been. So my comment was, hey, you know what? If I'm unable to influence them to make this change on their own, then it would be a failure. But I was recently corrected. And if you're following me on LinkedIn, you'll see the post that I made in regards to that comment. And this, a young radiologist corrected me. And he made me realize that what I said was very misplaced. Because in his comment, it was a very thoughtful comment, he disagreed. And he said, no, I don't think it's going to be a failure, Paul, because your advocacy has helped me avoid signing a non-compete. And the education you've provided has enabled me to be smarter about contracts. And I mean, he went on, and it made me realize that, yeah, you know what? If I can help influence one veterinarian, just one, to avoid a non-compete and to improve their work environment, then my mission was successful. So, in hindsight, I take that back, right? So obviously I feel like I've definitely helped more than just one. But, Oren, who's the gentleman on LinkedIn who made that comment, he's the one who really opened my eyes up, and he hit me square in the chest with that comment. And I really don't have words for it, but it got me emotional. I'm not going to lie.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. That's amazing. And for our listeners out there, we're going to do a series here addressing some of the things with non-competes and employment, just to kind of have a lot of different opinions shared on this topic. So we are going to be diving deep here. But before we get into all the other episodes, Paul, from you, in your words, it would be great to if you could just explain what a non-compete is at the highest level, how it's used. But I would also like after that to dig into non-solicits a little bit and hear, because in the end of the day, if the FTC does outlaw non-competes and say veterinarians broadly decide, collectively, they're not going to sign employment agreements with non-competes, I would imagine there would still be a place for a non-solicit. So I'm curious as to, again, first, if you could just share the difference between the two, and then second, share your opinion about non-solicits as well.
Yeah, so I'll keep it as simple as I can. The non-compete is a contractual clause found in employment contracts that prevents the employee from working in a similar industry for a predetermined period of time and within a predetermined radius. The non-solicit is a contractual clause that simply prevents an employee from actively soliciting clients or employees from their previous employer. Now, the non-solicit is something that I have no problem with. I think that's a fair protection for the employer. There's a whole host of things that protect the employer. And, the non-solicit is just one of many on that list. And I have no problem with it. What I do have a problem with, though, is in these contractual clauses, especially for a non-solicit, and I've seen it all over contracts, they use very broad terminology. So, for example, they'll say things like, you cannot directly or indirectly solicit our employees or clients, right? Very simplistic version of a non-solicit. Well, what they don't do is explain or expand upon what does indirectly mean.
Right.
So when I'm coaching or when I'm consulting with veterinarians and they're asking me to review their contracts, I will tell them, or I'll ask them to go back to the employer to counter the employer's offer and have that word indirectly either defined or stricken from the contract. All right. Because what they're doing with that term is just casting this broad net that they can come back and hold you accountable for, whether you actively did something or not. And the hypocrisy in that is when you get a job with a new employer, especially in the veterinary industry, one of the first things they do is advertise the new veterinarian they just hired. So they'll go on social media, they'll put banners up on their hospitals, they'll take ads out in any kind of local advertising channels, and they'll say, hey, you know what, Dr. Smith is joining our team, and come see Dr. Smith, all this great stuff about that doctor. Well, that employer is now performing an indirect solicitation that the doctor can be held accountable for by their previous employer. Right. But they're asking you to do that in their contract, but yet they're going to do the same thing that they're trying to prevent anyway. So there's just so much hypocrisy going on right now. So every time, like I said, every time I'm talking to a veterinarian, that word indirectly, any kind of ambiguous term or a term that is just not clearly identified, I'll always highlight it, call it out, send it back to them, and I say either get a definition for this or have it removed.
No, I mean, I think that's great advice, right? Like the more ambiguity there is around any of that, the more difficult position the individual is in. And I mean, I love that advice, Paul. I want to circle back to something, and I kind of, this is not anything we've talked about ahead of time, but you got me thinking about a lot, and just something that I'm trying to wrap my arms around, right? Because I work with individual veterinarians, but I've also been involved in the transaction side of the veterinary world for years. And you talked a lot about the ecosystem, Paul, and how the veterinarians rely upon the technicians, and the technicians rely upon the hospital administrators and the support staff, and just kind of this whole wonderful ecosystem that works and operates, right? One of the things that I've oftentimes thought about is like, obviously, if the non-compete goes away, it completely shakes up this world and ecosystem. Right, wrong, or indifferent, there's obviously some comfort in what that ecosystem looks like. Not necessarily for the individual doctors, but potentially for just kind of the overall ecosystem. You've lived in California where those non-competes aren't available. Can you talk a little bit about how the ecosystem works for like an individual doctor who owns a hospital with associates, with technicians, and an ecosystem where there aren't non-compete agreements in place, and just help our listeners understand what you've seen there?
Yeah, well, I really don't think it operates very differently than any other type of business, other than the fact that an employer without a non-compete is generally going to have a much more beneficial work environment, right? A much more inclusive work environment, one where the employees are actually happy and thriving because that employer knows that they need to do a better job to retain versus relying on a non-compete to force people to stay. They have to treat their people correctly. They have to treat them right in order to entice them to stay, right? Now, the thing is that I get a lot of feedback from employers, at least when I originally started this advocacy, saying how badly they needed the non-compete and how, it's intended to protect their business. But you've got an entire state, several states that operate without non-competes. And these are some major hubs of industry, right? I mean, even in the veterinary industry, these groups like the NVAs and the VCAs that have a national footprint, if you did some research into them, you'll find that California is one of their most productive and profitable markets, right? So it's, again, back to that hypocrisy, right? So they don't necessarily need it in California to sustain a good business, but yet they're going to say that they need it elsewhere. to do the same exact thing. It just makes no sense. So I think the immediate result of not having a non-compete is an enhanced work environment, right? It's one where now the employer realizes that, hey, these people aren't chained to me. I need to do better to retain them, right? And now you also have an environment where the employees can thrive because, if I'm in a situation where, maybe I'm working at this 4 or 5 doctor practice and I'm ready for leadership, right? I'm ready to start grooming for a medical director type role, but they don't have that opportunity there. They don't have that opportunity in my current workplace, but the hospital across the street does. Well, why shouldn't I be able to get that opportunity? Right? Just because I'm working here doesn't mean that all my future opportunities need to be forgotten and overlooked, right? Although you may not be able to provide that opportunity, that doesn't mean that it's a bad workplace or that I'm a bad employee. It's just, hey, that's the situation we're currently in, but I should be free to walk across the street and do what I need to do to further my career and enhance my skill set. But the non-compete prevents that.
No, absolutely. Now, just perspective, would love to get your thoughts. Is there any risk, right, where that person can leave and it upsets some of that ecosystem in the business, for maybe not so much the corporate groups who have, deeper balance sheets to offset that, but an individual hospital owner who loses somebody, whether it be for the right reasons or potentially bad, kind of the bad apple, right? Hey, I don't like it here, so I want to go across the street. Or is that hey, this is kind of how business works, and we all have to be prepared for the best? And I know that's a tough question, Paul, but I figure why not throw it out there and let's hit it head on.
No, I don't think it's necessarily a tough question. I think it's a question that people make tougher than it needs to be, because at the end of the day, who goes into business thinking that the team I hire is the team I'm going to have until the end of time, right? It's a normal function of running a business. People come and people go, right? Now, as in the veterinary practices, right, what I hear a lot is, well, if they leave, they're going to take all my clients with them. Right? That's always the number one argument I hear in defense of the non-compete. And my argument is, well, hey, if you're relying solely on the veterinarian to establish that client relationship and client experience, well, then you failed as an owner. Okay? Because what you need to be doing as an owner is creating a differentiated client experience, right, that builds loyalty to your brand and not just relying on the veterinarian to do that. All right. That experience occurs the second I open your front door. Okay. Did your receptionist say good morning to me? Does your receptionist know my name? Does your hospital smell good? Are your prices fair, right? Are your prices competitive with what's being offered across the street? That's how you build loyalty to your brand. But if you're relying on any one employee to do that, well, then, like I said, you failed as a business owner. Your job is to create that differentiated experience, not just for your staff, but also for your clients, to build that loyalty to your brand. Now, yes, chances are, you're probably going to lose some. You may end up losing some patients, right? So if my doctor takes a job at another hospital and I've got a good relationship with him or her, and hey, it's not too far of a distance for me, chances are I'm going to follow that veterinarian. That is a known impact in this industry. That is a known effect, right? So prepare for it. And any business owner who's not preparing for things like that, again, they're just shooting themselves in the foot. But then you need to ask yourself, why are people leaving? All right. If you're having a significant number of regrettable losses, you need to take a look in the mirror. You need to take a look at your leadership team. What is going on? What failures are occurring? What's happening that you are not aware of? All right. It's just that simple. But these are all basic fundamental principles of owning a business. These things are going to happen. And if you're not prepared for them, the only person to blame is yourself.
Yeah, there's two things that I'm thinking about. One is if you're worried about a specific individual leaving and competing with you and taking a significant chunk of business, that should also be the type of person you are eager to make happy and continue to nurture. Right.
Exactly.
So we should be able to kind of pair those two together. And out in the community right now, I mean, clearly, I mean, inflation, I would say, was the biggest thing we were talking about with clients in 2022 for sure. The employment situation is obviously either close number two or number one to some of these business owners. But now it seems like it's still number one with the employment and the lack of veterinarians out there. Are you advising your business owner clients now to remove the non-compete altogether as a way to entice and, maybe provide a different offer than what the average veterinarian is going to get, especially if they go to the corporates? Like, is that something you're working with your clients on?
Absolutely. And I'm doing it in two different ways. And one way is actually kind of funny, but the bottom line is that there aren't, from my point of view, there is no major differentiator available in this industry right now other than the non-compete. And what I mean by that, one of the things when I'm consulting with practice owners or even with the small corporate groups that ask me to come out and help them with their recruiting teams, I tell them, you need to be able to identify your differentiator, explain and be able to articulate why what you have is better than what that candidate currently has. Okay. Now, if you rewind about anywhere between 3 to 5 years ago, the biggest differentiator in the veterinary industry was mentorship, right? Remember when everybody started coming out with all this advertising, this beautiful advertising about their mentorship programs and structured mentorship programs, things like that? Well, now everybody has it. And to be honest with you, that word was utilized very poorly. I think it was just what's being offered is not mentorship. It's called on-the-job training, right? Mentorship is a relationship, a long-lasting relationship between two individuals, one of which is going to help the other avoid those mistakes that they made and help them further their career, right? And that relationship lasts for as long as it possibly can. Right. What we're seeing now is advertising of mentorship, but really it's a checklist based on the job training protocol. Right. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm here saying, let's call it what it is. Right. You're more likely to get mentorship at a private practice than you are at a corporate practice. Right. Because those private practice owners, their success is mutually tied to your success. So those practice owners want your skills to increase. They want you to avoid those mistakes. They want you to do things that are going to make you a more productive doctor. Right? So that is more in line with mentorship than anything else. But right now, the non-compete is the biggest differentiator. And, that funny thing that I was just talking about is when I could call any random hospital in this country. And I do this regularly. And I'll find a candidate that wants to work somewhere in whatever state, whatever city, and I'll cold call, or somebody on my team will cold call hospitals in that area. And the first question we ask is, are you hiring? And 9.9 out of 10 times they say yes. And then the next question is, do you require a non-compete? And more often than not, they say yes. And then we'll say, well, you know what, unfortunately, I apologize, but we're not going to be able to place our candidate because we do not support hospitals or employers that require non-competes. And immediately the next thing they say, oh, don't worry about it. Let's meet your candidate. I don't need that non-compete. Right? All of a sudden, the non-compete is no longer that important to them, right? Because they need the talent more than they need that contractual clause, right? But so that's one way. And that has been, I've done that several times just, in the last year or so. And literally every single time it's worked beautifully. But yes, when I'm consulting and talking to clients, I tell them, look, if a candidate has two offers that are necessarily fairly the same, right? One's from a corporate employer requiring a non-compete and one's from let's say an independent practice that's not requiring a non-compete. And that's the only differentiator between the two offers. Well, yeah, they're most likely going to take the offer that doesn't come with any kind of handcuffs, right? So that's how you can differentiate right now. And what I'm telling folks, I was just doing a series of webinars around this. I'm telling folks that they have, especially the private independent practices, I'm estimating they have a window of about 18 to 24 months, right? That's what I'm thinking. That's how long it'll take the FTC to step in and implement this proposed rule. Now, obviously, I could be completely wrong at that, but that's my estimate. And what that means is that these independent practices have that 18 to 24 month window to differentiate themselves and to start attracting talent in a way that the corporates can't, because the corporates have made it abundantly clear, at least to me, they are not going to change. Right? The majority of them, the major ones, they are not going to change. Now, I am working with some mid to smaller size groups that are looking at ending their non-compete, and I'm super excited about that. I'm hoping we can make an announcement about the first one here pretty soon. But the major guys, the major players, they're not going to change. All right. So that is going to be the differentiator.
Absolutely. I one follow-up question, Paul, that we see, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, is sometimes we're seeing more and more minority ownership opportunities presented, whether that be from independents or consolidated groups at hospitals. Some of those come along with the non-competes that are tied back into the operating agreements. Do you view those, if you're a minority shareholder, similar to employment agreements? Do you think there's incremental responsibilities that are associated with that minority ownership? How are you guiding your clients when they see those opportunities presented to them, and how to think about them?
Yeah, well, put it this way. I haven't seen, how about I say it this way? I haven't seen a contract for an associate veterinarian in which they were being offered a minority ownership stake, in which that stake was beneficial enough to allow that employer to restrict your license. I just haven't seen it. Now, in those situations, when we're starting to talk about ownership, again, I'm speculating here, but I have to believe that once we're at that level of negotiations, both parties will be represented, and both parties will have some type of legal representation that's looking out for their best interests. All right. So in that case, I don't have a dog in that fight. Right. When both parties are equally represented, then really I think their interests are being taken care of and being handled appropriately. And then both are making educated decisions. My concern is the associate veterinarian who isn't going to hire an attorney, right? They just don't have the money to hire an attorney. All they're doing is looking for a new job, right? Especially these new graduates. And these are folks who generally aren't very savvy in these contractual clauses, and many of them have been conditioned to believe that these contracts are just a standard part of becoming a doctor, right? And these contracts are things that, hey, they just need to accept as is, because they're not being taught in their schools, and they're not being empowered to push back on things like this, right? And that's where I'm kind of taking up and filling that void. But in terms of partnership agreements and ownership agreements, those folks are represented by lawyers. Let them hash it out and, make those decisions based on the needs of yourself and your families. But other than that, I'm helping the ones that aren't, for the most part, are not going to be represented.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I was going to ask about, when a hospital owner sells their practice to a corporate or even an associate sale, whether or not a non-compete is warranted. It sounds like, based on your previous answer, that you're not really getting involved in that one, that you're really focused more so on the veterinarians coming into a new place and kind of understand where it could make sense in other scenarios, and everybody's well armed and well equipped to, defend their own position. Is that a fair assessment?
Somewhat. Now, there is a portion of that, right, where when you said, hey, the sale of the hospital, right? So there's a contractual clause in many of these contracts. The assessors and assignees, it's usually on the last page of these contracts, and it's an easily overlooked contractual clause. But basically what it says is that if you sign this contract and I sell my practice, I can assign all the terms of this contract over to the new buyer, and you're going to have to uphold those. But you cannot assign your responsibilities to anybody else. So what that means is, let's say I am a veterinarian who worked for, name any of the alphabet soup corporations, all right? And then I take a job at a private practice, right? Because I just got burnt out from that corporation, did not like their culture, did not like the way I was treated, went to a private practice, everything's great. A couple years later, now that private practice wants to sell to the same employer that I just left a couple years previous. And because I signed that and it had that that assignees clause into the contract, I now become an employee of the place I was just trying to get away from. And my non-compete will be upheld.
Right.
Right. So that clause is something else that I'm starting to pay very close attention to. And I'm recommending all the doctors that I talk to get that taken out. Right. Because at the end of the day, here's the litmus test I put to every employment contract. Are the terms mutually beneficial? It is that simple. Okay. The employment relationship should be a mutually beneficial relationship. I provide you a service. You pay me for that service. And that is it. All right. But now, if you're going to put contractual clauses that benefit you and don't benefit me, now that relationship becomes skewed. So if you look at every single sentence and ask, is this mutually beneficial? Is there a benefit to me and a benefit to them? And if there isn't, there's a problem with it, right? So for example, non-disparagement clauses, right? Now, I necessarily don't have a problem with non-disparagement clauses as long as they're written in a very specific manner. What I'm now seeing are clauses that prevent the veterinarian from saying anything that I don't like. But for example, a non-disparagement clause I just saw said, hey, you cannot do X, Y, and Z. You can't say X, Y, and Z about us, right? But it doesn't say anything about what the employer can do for the employee, right? So it's not a mutually beneficial clause. So I tell them either get that stricken out or say, hey, I can't say this about you and you can't say this about me, right? Let's make it mutually beneficial. This can't be, employment is not a one-way street. Interviewing is not a one-way street. Offers are not a one-way street. There's nothing about it that's a one-way street. So again, very simple litmus test for your listeners. If you're looking at a contract, ask yourself, is this mutually beneficial? And if it isn't, make it mutually beneficial.
I like that. That's good. It's a good way to think about it. Before we go back to Travis with a few wrap-up questions, I was just hoping that we could kind of end this on a very positive note, and would love for you to just kind of paint a word picture for us and for our listeners on what this world looks like, what the veterinary hiring world looks like in the event of no non-compete. So how is it different for associates, hospital owners, and if you can, and selfishly, to pet owners as well? If you could just kind of wrap us up with that thought in mind, what does this all look like?
Without non-competes, what does it look like? Well, it looks like an environment where veterinarians will no longer have to stay in environments that aren't a fit for them, right? I think what we'll see is a reduction in mental health issues with veterinarians, right? Because a lot of what people don't talk about are the mental health impacts of having to stay in a toxic work environment because, number one, I can't relocate. Maybe I can't take an extended commute, right? So those are generally the biggest reasons why people have to stay. Oh, and I don't have the luxury of just not working for the 2 years while I wait for my non-compete to expire, right? So those veterinarians are the ones that are having some significant mental health impacts from this. For pet owners, it means that you're going to have more choices. Whereas, I don't think we have the time for me to dive into this last example from Blue Pearl, but if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see it. I wrote all about it. The thing is that the non-compete also limits pet parents' choices, right? So when an employer comes in, like a major corporate employer, and they lock down all these veterinarians to non-competes, and those veterinarians decide, hey, this isn't the place I want to work, well, those veterinarians now have to leave their community, right? They either have to move out of the community or work outside that community, which means the pet parents in that community have limited access to care now, right? So this non-compete has far-reaching effects far beyond just the employer and the employee, right? But without them, what I think you're going to start seeing is enhanced work environments for all veterinary professionals. It'll be a work environment where the employers now know we have to do better. We have to treat our teams better. We have to make sure they're well paid, well respected, right? That they're challenged, that they have promotional opportunities to grow their careers. Oh, and by the way, if we can't provide it, we should be the employer that is helping them find it, right? I think what you're going to see is a shift from being an employer that says, hey, you have to stay here. You can't go make money for anybody else, right? You're tied to this place, versus being the employer that people are proud to be from, right? That's what you should really want. You should want to be the employer that people are proud to be from, right? Hey, I'm not working there, not because I don't want to, it's because, my husband got deployed or my wife had to take a different job somewhere else. That's why we moved our family. But hey, that was a great place to work, right? And then that employee becomes your number one recruiter. They become your number one marketing asset because they're telling the world how great you were to them. That's what we'll see.
No, obviously that's a great goal. And I think through some of your work, Paul, we're going to see some changes coming in the future, and what the vet industry looks like, just like it looks vastly different than it did 10 years ago. Hopefully the three of us can get together 10 years from now and talk about what it looks like, and it'll be exciting and probably very different.
I hope so too. And if I'm successful at what I'm doing with my current advocacy and some plans that I have here for the future, I think what we're going to see is a resurgence of the independently owned practices as well, and veterinarians getting into ownership and being able to successfully run those independent practices without fear of being consolidated.
It'll be very interesting to see, and I certainly hope that we continue to create opportunities for independent hospital owners. That's not saying we want the consolidators to go away, but I think a lot of innovation and a lot of new ideas and improvement, quite frankly, selfishly for myself as a pet owner, occurs when you've got independent entrepreneurs that are trying to think about how to do things better and differently.
Absolutely. So, I couldn't agree more.
Before we let you go, Paul, I don't know if you've listened to any of the episodes, we kind of always wrap this up with there's the saying, everybody wants to change the world. No one wants to change the toilet paper roll. Have you ever snuck out of, either a home bathroom or a public restroom? Public restroom would maybe give you a pass, but snuck out without changing the toilet paper roll?
I generally try to not use toilet paper in other people's homes. But
in 15 episodes, we've never had anybody respond that way.
There you go. The answer would be no. I have not. So one of the things you learn in the Marine Corps, one of the first things you learn in the Marine Corps is that we return things better than when we found them, better than how we found them, right? So if I use something of yours, you better believe that I'm going to replace more of it. If I borrow something, you're going to get it back in a better condition than when you gave it to me. So that's just something that's been instilled in me since I was 18 years old.
I like it. You're welcome to borrow any of my stuff anytime, Paul.
Yeah, I get that quite often, especially cars.
As our kind of final parting piece, is there, for all the veterinarians who, have been riding alongside you on your journey or looking maybe at something else that they're very passionate about changing, if somebody wants to change the world, what's your one piece of advice to do that?
Don't listen to those who say it's impossible.
Pretty simple. I love it.
You know what, man? There are so many people, especially when I first started this advocacy, although they didn't do it very publicly, but they were coming after me privately. And I spent a lot of time trying to convince them otherwise, right? We would have good dialogue, and at least what I thought was good dialogue. But, some people's mind they're just never going to change, right? They're just stuck in their ways. But that doesn't mean you still can't have a positive influence. So if you're out to change the world and you think you've got an idea to do it, then you know what? Just chase it. Follow it until you can't do it anymore. But don't let those outside influences steer you off your path.
No, that's awesome. I love it. Very succinct. So, Paul, thanks so much for jumping on. It's the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Paul, before we go, just give us a 30, 60-second elevator story on Offer First, what you're up to, and how people can find you if they're interested, as we have a lot of veterinarians and hospital owners as listeners.
Yeah, so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to even say this, but Offer First is a new company that I'm launching in June. It's a technology company that is going to change the way employers and candidates engage. You can find it at offerfirst.com. I've got a early sign up page, right? So offerfirst.com/early sign up for employers. If you sign up prior to launch, we are offering some discounts on the service fees. But for the job seekers themselves, I am confident, and I'm saying this from 21 years experience in the recruiting industry. There is not a single recruiting or employment related technology available that provides the value that Offer First will provide to you. It is going to give you a simplistic and instantaneous way to negotiate your offers, and it's going to do so without any kind of the emotional influence that you experience in today's current environment. It's much more transparent than any other employment platform you've ever seen. I can guarantee that no user on this platform will ever get ghosted, which is a huge problem. And there's just a whole host of services that Offer First does that no other platform does. So, I built this intentionally with the veterinarian in mind, although it's going to expand into other industries. But the veterinary industry is the one where my heart is right now. I've gotten so much support from veterinary professionals over this last year through my advocacy for the non-compete. So I feel this is my way of giving back to them. And I can promise you, you utilize Offer First, it'll change the way you look for a job forever. You'll never want to use anything else.
Awesome. I love it. And we look forward to hearing how that launch goes. And maybe we'll do another podcast episode in 6 months and check in on you and see how everything's going. How's that sound?
That'd be great. I'd love to join you guys again. This was fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome.
Thanks
well, we loved having
Paul.
you on, Paul. Appreciate your time. This is the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Have a good day, folks. Bye. Thanks again for tuning in to the Vet Worthwhile podcast. You can find us online at signaturefd.com/signatureveterinary. And then our ask would be, if you found this episode valuable, just think of one friend or colleague that you think would enjoy the content and just please share. So thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Travis York is the owner of 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and a partner of Signature FD. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors is a veterinary consulting and strategic planning firm of which Signature FD has no involvement or ownership. James Yost is a partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD. Signature FD is an investment advisor registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and Signature FD are not affiliated. Mr. York provides all non-investment advisory services through 3-in-1 Vet Advisors. The opinions of the guests and the contents of this podcast are intended to be educational only and should not be relied upon as investment, tax, business, or planning advice. You should consult with a professional advisor prior to taking any course of action that may impact you or your business.